Hello, this is Wes Terasaki, and our chapter today is Nehemiah 12. We're almost done with the series, with only one chapter remaining after today. There are two main parts to chapter 12. The first we might call priests and Levites, and the second, the dedication of the Jerusalem wall. So priests and Levites, and the dedication of the Jerusalem wall. Here's an outline with some added details. Under the subheading of priests and Levites, there are some lists of people. These lists can be somewhat difficult to follow because the author is actually not trying to give us a history or chronology. He is mostly cataloging the Levitical people involved over the years. So the lists in the first 26 verses include names of the earliest people that returned from captivity, as well as later contemporaries of Ezra and Nehemiah. The emphasis is not so much on the order of events as on the continuity of people and ministry in the post-exilic period, that is, in the years after the return from exile. The first group is those that came with Zerubbabel. As you may recall, this occurred in 538 BC and involved over 40,000 people, including priests and Levites. The high priest that came with Zerubbabel was named Joshua. Nehemiah then gives us a recounting of the succession of high priests from Joshua on. Joshua's son, Joachim, became the next high priest, and he was succeeded by his son, Eliashib, who was the high priest at the time of Nehemiah. This may be the priest Eliashib who is friends with Tobiah the Ammonite in chapter 13. Also, he ends up being a relative of Nehemiah's old nemesis, Sanballat. Next, you'll note that there are lists of priestly families that lived at the time of Joachim the high priest, and then a list of the heads of the Levitical families at that time. In between these two lists, Nehemiah tells us that all the names were preserved during the reign of Persian King Darius in the Book of the Annals, the official court records. The second major section of this chapter describes the dedication of the Jerusalem wall. This is quite a massive and elaborate affair with a processional on top of the walls of the city and joyful, loud music. Remember in chapter 4 when Tobiah scoffed at the Jews, saying that even a little fox could collapse the wall they were building? Well, what's he saying now? Scholars estimate that the wall was some 8 feet thick, made of solid stone, and able to support hundreds of people in celebration. Lastly, note that the ceremony does not just end. It is followed by the people making specific, firm commitments to the temple and to worship. Okay, so that summarizes Nehemiah chapter 12. This is a good time to suggest the Bible study tip for today, and that is define terms. And that means be sure to know what we're talking about. We can't leave words vague and ill-defined and hope to understand the passages in which they occur. Recall that we sought to understand the meaning of covenant in chapter 10. In our chapter today, there are at least 3 major terms to know: Levites, priests, and dedication. Let's be sure to understand who the Levites are, who the priests are, and what it means to dedicate something, okay? First, Levites. They are the people of the tribe that descended from Levi, one of the 12 original tribes of Israel. What's so special about Levites as opposed to any of the other tribes? The Lord set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, to stand before the Lord, to minister, and to pronounce blessings in His name. That is why the Levites have no share or inheritance among their fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as the Lord your God told them. By no share, God indicated that the Levites will not have a portion of the land for themselves, like all the other tribes, but would live in specific cities within each of the 12 tribal territories. God used the Levites to save the nation of Israel at least 3 times in history. In Egypt, God saved and protected Moses, a Levite, from Pharaoh, enabling him to grow up and lead Israel out of captivity. During the time in the wilderness when Israel turned from God to worship a golden calf, only the Levites sided with Moses, and God used them to bring his wrath upon many Israelites. Phinehas, a Levite, helped curtail God's judgment, a plague, on the nation when they chose to follow the gods of Moab. So the descendants of Levi became God's representatives to the Israelite nation. Their roles would be to serve as assistants to the priests, take care of the tabernacle and later the temple, be choristers, musicians, gatekeepers, judges, craftsmen for the temple, supervisors of chambers and courts, overseers of the temple treasuries, and officers in charge of royal service. Teach the Torah, as we saw them do in Nehemiah 8. In this sense, there was some overlap between the duties of the Levites and the priests. And the Levites generally did not do other work to earn money or support themselves. They were financially supported by a tithe of the people. This is similar to the way many pastors are supported today. So it appears that they did almost everything related to the religious life of the people. That is, everything except what the priests did. So who are the priests, and what did they do? And how are they different from the Levites? The priests were a subcategory of Levites that were set apart by God for special service. The brothers Moses and Aaron were descendants of Levi through his son Kohath, and God designated the family line of Aaron to be the priests for Israel. Therefore, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. They are all descended from the Levite Aaron. By divine appointment, only priests are to perform sacrifices in behalf of the people. Only one priest, the firstborn or high priest, can enter the innermost portion of the temple, the most holy place, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement. The high priest bore the names of the 12 tribes of Israel on his breastplate into the sanctuary, and thus represented all the people before God. The priests are in fact the go-between between God and the people. And that is the main point. In Israel, the priesthood represented the nation's relationship with God. The covenant of God was mediated through the priests. No one else in Israel had that role or privilege. We'll have a little more to say about priests in a moment, but let's move on to the term dedication. The last half of our chapter is the dedication of the wall. What is meant by dedication? We could describe at least 5 defining aspects of dedications, and they all conveniently start with the letter C. They are ceremony, the public ritual enacted to commemorate the occasion; celebration, the joyful festivities; consecration. We generally don't want to define a difficult term like dedication with an even more difficult one like consecration. But for now, let's not be too technical and say that this means to set apart something to deem it holy before God. Commitment. We're not only thankful, but we have determined to take action. We make a pledge. Community. This is not a private affair, but a publicly recognized proclamation involving the larger family of God. So dedications involve ceremony, celebration, consecration, commitment, and community. There are other times in the Bible when major dedications have occurred. 2 that come to mind are the dedication of the temple by King Solomon some 400 years before, and the more recent dedication of the Second Temple by the Jews that first returned from exile. And we can compare these events to the present dedication of the wall in Nehemiah. When Solomon completed the temple, he gathered all the Israelites for a ceremony and festival. Sacrifices were made, and the Ark of the Covenant was officially moved and placed within the temple. A cloud filled the sanctuary, setting it apart, if you will, indicating God's presence and preventing the priests from performing their service at that time. The people's hearts were said to be fully committed, and Solomon offered praise and a famous extended prayer. When the first Jews who returned to Judah completed the second temple, the original temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, there was a formal dedication that was combined with the Passover celebration. Again, this was a nationwide celebration in recognition of God's hand in restoring the house of God. Today, as we study Nehemiah 12, note how the dedication of the wall incorporates the same fundamentals of ceremony, celebration, commitment, consecration, and community. In the truest sense of the word, this is a dedication that carries on an established spiritual tradition. And by the way, dedications are not only a thing of the past. For instance, at Lighthouse, we do child dedications. I believe they contain the same elements as those dedications seen in the Old Testament. We have a ceremony during a Sunday service. It is certainly a celebration and a time of joy for the new life that God has brought into our midst. We recognize the importance of God's calling on the life of our child, and there is a pledge on the part of both the parents and the greater faith family to help bring up the child in a godly and responsible manner. Dedications have meaning and relevance for the church today. But what about priests? Do they have meaning and relevance for the church today? Unlike the Catholic Church, where there are priests or presbyters and bishops, in our Christian churches we do not have priests. Or do we? Recall that the priest was the intermediary between God and the Israelites, and the Old Covenant was based on that mediation. But in the New Covenant, there's no longer the priesthood as it was known in Old Testament times. It is no longer needed. And why is that? For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man, Jesus Christ. One and only one mediator. And if that is true, all of us believers who have Christ within us have direct access to God, making each of us part of the priesthood. God's original intention in Exodus that Israel become a kingdom of priests is now the reality in the body of Christ. You, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So look around. We do have priests. Our church is filled with them. You may not look anything like a priest of old, but God has made it clear. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess.